Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the second book of Chronicles, the first chapter, and just some brief literary context before we delve into the text itself. Now, a lot of the characters and events described in both books of Chronicles intersect or repeat themselves from that which we read in the two books of Samuel and the two books of King. The first book of Chronicles solely pertains to the reign of David, whereas the second book of Chronicles pertains to the reign of Solomon and his successors in the kingdom of Judah, and it makes scarce mention of the kings of Israel. And this was for two reasons. One, the authorship of the material upon which Chronicles is based. Chronicles is written post-exilic by Ezra, most scholarly consensus settles on, whereas those of Samuel and Kings are written pre-exilic, where the author is of somewhat more mysterious origin. Samuel couldn't have written past a certain point, which describes his death, and the Book of Kings bears no namesake. But the Israelites were distinct from the majority of their ancient Near Eastern counterparts in that they recorded history, warts and all. They weren't afraid to show themselves or their leaders in an unflattering light for the sake of objective and honest critique so that posterity might benefit from their mistakes. Now, this is commensurate with the object of history, which is to provide an objective standard of truth for future generations to learn from history, lest they repeat its cycle. And the tragedy of history is that even though we have this volume of information, we never quite seem to learn by it, so history repeats its vicious cycle ad nauseum, ad infinitum, but we shouldn't be without excuse. Now, the Chronicle books are significant in that they do a whitewashing of sorts. They do purge out all the unflattering elements, and there was a purpose behind this. Ezra was a priest writing in the post-exilic period, so when he wrote them for the Jews that had returned to their homeland after a 70-year captivity, he wanted to give them the best examples possible. So a lot of the stuff we read in the Chronicles, we don't read of in Kings and Samuels. So we're going to hop from the text there and just keep that thought in mind because it might spring up as we read. And Solomon, son of David, strengthened himself over his kingdom, and Yahweh his Elohim was with him, and made him exceedingly great. So this introductory verse, makes no mention at all of the power struggle with which Solomon ultimately triumphed over his rival claimants, other sons of David, made mention of in the first two books of Kings. So a lot of the necessary but unglamorous aspects of rulership are whitewashed almost. And Solomon spoke to all Israel, to the commanders of the thousands and of the hundreds, to the judges, and to every leader in all Israel, the heads of the fathers. So he was 19 years old, yet over every other figure of authority by those aforementioned divisions. And he's calling them into an act of unity because what he's about to do is significant for the unity of the nation. And Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon, for Elohim's tent of appointments was there, which Moses the servant had made in the wilderness. Now the tent or tabernacle was the central location in which the divine presence dwelt. It accompanied them throughout the Exodus, and it was in tent form because they were a mobile people. They weren't settled in a stationary location yet, so Moses never actually set foot in Gibeon, let alone the Promised Land. Yet by that time in the centuries, even as they became a stationary people, they didn't have the stability or the wealth to build a more magnificent present dwelling place for the divine presence befitting his grandeur, and that's one of the reasons that Solomon was called to. Now, David so very badly being a man after God's own heart, Acts 13:22, 1 Samuel 13:14, he's implicitly alluded to as such in that. So he gathered the resources, and he actually moved the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. Now, Gibeon was 6 miles northeast of the Jerusalem, which had already been established as the capital of the United Monarchy and would remain the capital of the Kingdom of Judah after the monarchy split after Solomon's reign. However, David brought up the Ark of Elohim from Kiriath Yearim to the place David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. So a lot of what I just said, maybe I should have said after, but it doesn't hurt the order in which it's presented as long as it gets said. And the bronze altar that Bethshael, son of Uri, son of Hur, had made and put before the temple of Yahweh, and Solomon and all the assembly sought it. So this is a historical reference to an actual figure who we read of in the Pentateuch, who was gifted with a creative being, delegated the task of designing many of the embroidered and artistic, utilitarian and functional aesthetic pieces behind the in the tabernacle was this Bethshael, son of Uri, and he was of Moses' generation, so what he had constructed still last and would remain intact in the temple, at least until it was destroyed. And Solomon went up there to the bronze altar before Yahweh, which was at the tent of appointments, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. So this wasn't a small sacrifice. This was a large mass-scale sacrifice before the whole nation, and it was ultimately for a reason, because it was no simple occasion. It was a newly anointed, newly ascendant monarch, and he wanted to be on good terms with Yahweh. So that night Elohim appeared to Solomon and asked him and said to him, "Ask what I should give you." Now I want you to pause and ask yourself, if a divine being visited you in a dream and gave you anything you wanted in the entire world, what would you ask? Now I want you to take a pause and imagine that you're a 19-year-old ruler of an inexperienced ruler of the United Kingdom, of the covenant nation, of the Almighty Maker of heaven and earth, and that might alter your answer differently. So we're going to see how Solomon answers that question, because this is a unprecedented opportunity. And Solomon said to Elohim, "You have shown great kindness to David, my father, and have made me king in his place." So he's acknowledging the debt and token of gratitude for he owes his position to him, more so than his father, his heavenly father. "Now Yahweh Elohim, let your promise to David my father stand fast, for you have appointed me to reign over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth." So this is a reference of the Abrahamic promise, whereby which he was promised descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the earth, the idea being wherever he looked, whether it was up or down, he would have that many descendants, probably with some hyperbole, but you get the point. "Now give me wisdom and knowledge, so that I go out and come in before this people. For who rightly rules this great people of yours?" Now, wisdom and knowledge were the most appropriate as well as practical wishes that someone in his situation, being a young, inexperienced monarch, charged and delegated with the task. Now, David had gathered the resources with which to build the temple, but the resourcefulness to utilize them properly and to do it in a manner befitting of the grandeur of the one to whom it pointed to was seemingly perplexing to this young ruler. And Elohim said to Solomon, "Because this was in your heart, and you have not asked riches or wealth, or esteem, or the life of your enemies, nor have you asked long life, but have asked wisdom and knowledge for yourself, so as to rightly rule my people, over whom I have appointed you to reign." Now, had he been in David's situation, his answer may have been a little different, because David was a soldier, Solomon was a scholar. Solomon was his name, Solomon, is derivative of the Hebrew term for peace, shalom, whereas David's reign was very much defined by war. He expanded and protected the borders of the kingdom and Solomon sought to advance the geopolitical position of what his father had fought for through trade and alliances. And the alliances led to marriages, which ultimately culminated in his downfall. But that's ultimately getting a little far ahead of ourselves. But he also significantly he humbles himself and exalts the nation. So he who humbles himself shall be exalted, and vice versa. We read of in the New Testament, Luke 14:11 and 18:14, and Matthew 23:12. So because his request is rooted in humility, he's going to not only give him what he asked for, but give him what he didn't ask for. And the prosperity, Solomon's reign would mark a golden age of such, and unfortunately nothing, all that glitters. It was ultimately comparable to what our recent historians have deemed the Gilded Age, in that the age of the robber barons, in that what is glitters on the surface is rusty underneath. So there were some deficiencies, but we read more of that in the King's account than the Chronicles. Wisdom and knowledge are given to you, and riches and wealth and esteem I give you, such as none of the kings who have had before you before, nor have any after you. So wisdom was a highly sought out commodity in the East, and every monarch was surrounded by an entourage of wise men. Solomon didn't ask for wise men to assist him. He asked for the wisdom himself to do what needed to be done. And this promise is available to us. Any of you lacking wisdom, James 1:5, ask in faith, not doubting, and Yahweh giveth liberally and upbraideth not. So now we may not have the same responsibilities as Solomon, so we're probably not going to be given an unprecedented amount, but we will be given the wisdom we need to complete the situation that as it requires when it comes. And we'll know when to ask for it. And wisdom has an addictive commodity, but there's no side effects. So there's nothing with wisdom that more of the same cannot cure. And knowledge is at the foundation of wisdom. But knowledge can be esoteric and mystical and abstract, but wisdom is highly the practical intelligence, the intelligent use of intelligence in a practical form. And Solomon went to Jerusalem from the high place that was at Gibeon before the tent of appointments, and reigned over Israel. So this event inaugurates the new era of a new king. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities, and with the king in Jerusalem. Now this was a warning ultimately anticipated in Deuteronomy 17, that a ruler would concentrate wealth excessively in his palace, and import foreign-born horses from Egypt, and the Egyptians were introduced to the horse by the Hyksos, Semitic neighbor to the Near East people who conquered them, disrupting the Middle Kingdom. And you can type in Corey Johnston Exodus 1 for more on that, but that's how horses arrived in Egypt, and they became there throughout what is known as the New Kingdom period. And the king made silver and gold to be as stones in Jerusalem, and he made cedars to be as plenty as the sycamores which are in the low country. Now silver and gold, there is archaeological evidence that the claims of the wealth of Solomon's Jerusalem were not exaggerated, and cedars were abundant in the country to the north, Lebanon, whose king David and Solomon cultivated trade alliance relationships with, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship. So much of the cedar which came into building the temple was not native grown, but the result of trade. So that's where the wisdom comes in, to utilize what is not indigenously available by seeking it from outside sources. And Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and from Kew. The king's merchants brought them in Kew at a price. Again, this is a reiteration of a warning in Deuteronomy 17. And they came up and brought from Egypt a chariot for 600 pieces of silver, and a horse for 150, And so for all the kings of the Hittites, the sovereigns of Aram, they brought them out by his hand. So this is just the commercial transaction, which are somewhat, you'd have to have a currency chart to give an exact estimation. I can't supply that with you off the top of my head, but we understand that 600 pieces of silver, being the price of a horse or chariot, was no chump change. So, and he clearly he could afford it, but he ultimately concentrated it to the detriment of things that are outlined as warnings in Deuteronomy 17. But the final lesson we should extract from all of this is, if any of you need wisdom, it's never more than a prayer away. Now, you may not have wisdom to such as an extent as Solomon, but it's probably not part of the divine plan for any of us to, because we don't carry his awful burden and responsibility. But we are still called to be wise, and we are still called to pray for it. So always remember James 1:5, ask in faith, not doubting. And Yahweh giveth liberally and upbraideth not. And that concludes today's message. Tune in next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.